Just gone 3 minutes after 8. I'm Natasha Devon, and I don't know if you've seen this story. It's trended on Twitter today, and it was reported in the Daily Mail, but it hasn't got much traction outside of that. And the Mail headline read, "Academic dies after being accused of anti-Semitism in Twitter pylon. Coroner to probe sudden death of Jewish father of three, 38, who was suing author Michael Rosen for branding him loathsome in a tweet that generated 4,000 complaints to his employer." Now, I don't propose to focus exclusively on this story this hour, but it is important to note that this story is more complex and nuanced than this headline would suggest. First of all, we don't actually know yet how Peter Newbon, who was the lecturer at Northumbria University, died. Secondly, the reason that Michael Rosen tweeted about Peter and tagged his employer is Peter shared an image of Jeremy Corbyn reading his book, Michael's book, We're Going on a Bear Hunt, to some children, but it was doctored so that the Protocols of Zion was superimposed over the page. For those unfamiliar, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a hugely anti-Semitic and entirely fabricated text purporting to describe a Jewish plan for global domination, and needless to say has played a huge part in popularising this belief that there's an international Jewish conspiracy which forms the basis of many alt-right and indeed far-left hate movements. Michael Rosen himself is Jewish, and when he saw the image in May last year, he wrote on Twitter, "If someone called Peter Newbon is on your payroll, this is to inform you that he superimposed the phrase the Protocols of Zion over a page from We're Going on a Bear Hunt by me and Helen Oxenbury. This is a loathsome and anti-Semitic thing to do." And he then tagged Peter's employer, Northumbria University. Now, Michael Rosen has 260,000 followers on Twitter, and at the time of broadcasting, the tweet had been retweeted more than 4,000 times. Peter Newbon also reportedly received hate mail as a result, and he was planning to take Michael Rosen to court for defamation. He filed papers just before Christmas. Now, Michael Rosen, of course, has been vocally supportive of Jeremy Corbyn and has questioned some of the accusations of anti-Semitism made against him. So what we have here, essentially, are two Jewish men engaged in a social media spat over whether or not the Labour Party was anti-Semitic under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And that is a discussion for another day, and one in which I suspect we will never all agree. But I have to say, from the information available on the story, and that won't be all-encompassing, I thought, this is just my opinion, the original doctored image of Jeremy Corbyn was pretty gross, to be honest, and I think that Michael Rosen had every right to call it out. But I do question the wisdom of getting Peter Newbon's employers involved. I wonder whether, essentially threatening this guy's job, whether the punishment fit the crime. But more than anything else, I wonder how useful it was for thousands of people to get involved in that spat and to pile in with their own thoughts, which would have inevitably been informed by tribal loyalties to a large degree. And this is not the first story of its kind by any stretch. Unfortunately, we see headlines like this all the time, with people being driven to despair by their experiences on social media. So do we, during these outrages, these feeding frenzies that happen on social media, do we forget that these are real people with lives and families and, perhaps most crucially, feelings involved? And is that just the nature of the beast, or is there a better way to hold people accountable? Because if you're angry about something, you absolutely should be able to use social media to hold people to account, to make your feelings known and to express your anger. But this pile-on culture, is it the best way to do it? Is it an inevitable consequence of social media, or is it something that we can either train ourselves out of or can actually be legislated against? Because, of course, the online harms bill is forthcoming. Is this something that the government actually has to step in to try and stop people from experiencing. The number to call is 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. Emma has called from Catford. What can you tell us?
Hello, my name's Emma Pickin, and I'm widely known as a director of Labour Against Anti-Semitism. Pete Newbon was a colleague of mine. He was another fellow director of Labour Against Anti-Semitism, but more importantly, he was a very good friend.
I'm really sorry for your loss.
Yeah, it's been an absolutely devastating week for all of us, everyone who knew Pete. We are completely blown away. And I don't think people fully appreciate just how loved he was, just what a great person he was, and just how much we all absolutely desperately miss him. And us just can't believe he's not with us anymore. So first of all, I wanted to pay tribute to Pete as my friend and as a fantastic campaigner against anti-Semitism, as somebody who was incredibly intelligent, who really knew his stuff, who was really educated over it. And so I just want, I just find it incredibly shocking to see him sort of become, this person I knew so well, become a victim of online bullying, as far as I'm concerned.
And that's the thing, isn't it? That, like I said in my introduction, I think as an author myself, if I saw an image where somebody had doctored a page from one of my books as it was being read to children, I think I would have a right to say, I disagree with this and call it out. But
yes,
it's all about who holds the balance of the power. If you have a platform and you have many followers, if you're tagging someone's employer in that, then a pile-on will inevitably follow. And not everybody has the capacity to deal with that, and nor should they have to.
I think also it's also to raise the point that memes fly about on the social media that Pete didn't realise or wouldn't have realised, because he didn't create the meme, that it was particularly linked to Michael Rosen's book.
Okay.
And as you know, there has been 94% of the Jewish community considered Jeremy Corbyn to be an anti-Semite. So I think that to a certain extent, yes, I can understand if somebody's upset, they have every right to complain. But I think that really, from the point of fact of Pete's position as somebody who'd combated anti-Semitism, I think there was a certain amount of outrage that was possibly directed more outside of the actual fact of the tweet, if that makes sense. And yes, there is also a huge imbalance of power in terms of somebody who has that many Twitter followers and a professor at a university who really has, no real ability, once he found himself in the eye of the storm, to sort of combat what was going on, you know.
And this is really, so many people talk about cancel culture, and they're people who aren't cancelled in any real sense whatsoever. In fact, their workload has increased since their so-called cancellation. And yet, this is, in a very real sense, when we see people with quote unquote ordinary jobs having their employers tagged on social media and being encouraged for people to make complaints to their employer, that's what we should be discussing when we talk about cancel culture, isn't it?
Yes, and also just for people who run organisations like ours, I mean, Pete was probably the only director of Labour Against Anti-Semitism that wasn't self-employed, and that's for a reason. That's because we do get an awful amount of harassment at work. Obviously not me, because I'm a painter and decorator, so I don't get harassed at work because nobody can. I work for myself. So it's also, I think, just for people to be a bit more aware of when somebody is campaigning about something, if you disagree with it, fine, but it's not okay to try and get them fired, And I'm not saying Michael Rosen was trying to get Pete fired, but what I am saying is that an awful lot of people who wrote into the university most definitely were trying to get him fired. They didn't know who he was. They didn't really understand that he was a person. He just was a Twitter account. And I think one of the things that I loved about Pete when I was working with him was that he always understood that there was a person behind every Twitter account. And I think more people need to understand that when you're in the middle of a feeding frenzy, why are you doing it? Why are you trying to get this professor fired from his job as a literary academic? There was... It's just the sort of baying of the mob. And I do think that, from my point of view, I do think that workplaces need to be more prepared to understand what's going on when something like this happens. And I also do think there needs to be some sort of legislation brought in place that can protect people from this, from this sort of situation, because it really has been, the toll that it took on Pete was huge. He was terribly, terribly stressed about it all. And my heart just goes out to his family and his wife and their children. It's the punishment in this case just absolutely bears no resemblance to the crime,
Emma, I'm so grateful that you were listening and that you picked up the phone today. And sorry again for your loss, and thank you for calling to share some of your thoughts about Pete. And also, I think, directing us really beautifully to some of the other questions that we need to ask this hour. When we are partaking in a pylon, when we're partaking in outrage culture, what Emma called a feeding frenzy, to what end are we doing that? What does justice look like? What does a good outcome look like? Do employers need to be more prepared for this type of situation? And would you like to see this addressed in the forthcoming online harms bill? If you want to get involved in the conversation, the number to call is 03. It's 18 minutes after 8, and I want to discuss with you this phenomenon of social media pylons. So this is usually where two high-profile people are engaged in a dispute, or somebody has said something publicly which has given offence to a large group of people, or they've perceived to have transgressed in some way. And then what follows is this feeding frenzy where that person is jumped on various social media platforms and receives thousands and thousands of messages. And I don't think it achieves anything. I don't know that anybody's ever had their mind changed by being at the centre of a pylon. And it also can take a psychological toll. I have been subject of numerous pylons myself because I'm a woman in media who says things and has opinions, and therefore it's inevitable, and arguably it goes with the territory. And I've had to develop a real thick rhino skin in order to be not devastated by them each time they happen. But I appreciate that my experience is not representative of your average person's, and anybody can find themselves at the centre of a pylon these days. So I wonder what you think causes them, whether you think that there is something that we will grow out of as social media and our use of social media becomes more sophisticated, or whether it's something that needs to be specifically legislated against, particularly in the new online harms bill. If so, what might that look like? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you want to get involved in the conversation. You can also text me on 84850 and tweet at LBC. Joe has called from Enfield. What can you tell us?
Hi, well, first I want to preface this by saying that my heart goes out to Dr. Newbon's family, who have suffered a devastating loss at this time. Firstly, what I want to say. And I also want to set the context of this slightly, because I think it's fair to say that this all sits against a wider context of Labour anti-Semitism,
yes,
of which, as we've already discussed, Dr. Newbon was a director of Labour against anti-Semitism. And of course, Labour had been found guilty of anti-Semitic harassment by the EHRC before this has occurred. So that was the context for Labour anti-Semitism, and of course, Jeremy Corbyn being found to be leader at the time this anti-Semitic harassment occurred. So that was the context. This was a satire, right? This image that Dr. Newbon shared, did not create, was a satire. Something that Michael Rosen himself had satirised his own bear hunt previously. In fact, on the same topic around similar about Labour anti-Semitism, about smears and all of this sort of stuff. So he was quite comfortable to satirise his own work in that context on the same topic. So I think that's important to understand, because it's not like his work was so precious and oriented at children that it couldn't be used for political ends. He himself had satirised this. And then we have to consider that both the gentlemen in question, Pete, Dr. Newbon, and Michael Rosen, are both Jewish.
Yeah.
So therefore it becomes almost an argument, satire, human offence between two Jewish men.
Sure.
What this doesn't require is an army, and I see it that way, a mob, harpies, whatever you want to call it, of other people against that proven factual context of satire, of proven anti-Semitism and Labour, led by Jeremy Corbyn, to then target a campaigner for anti-Semitism on spurious grounds of anti-Semitism himself. 4,000 of them plus complained to his employer. And more critically, to this very day, these same people, this 4,000 plus mob, are trolling his widow on Twitter. Every article, the Telegraph article, the Daily Mail article that has been referred to is being trolled right now with "it's a scam, he deserved it, how dare he deserved to die because he offended Michael Rosen and by extension Jeremy Corbyn, etc." Something has gone deeply wrong of the politics on the left as it's expressed on social media in this country, and I'm going for Trump, I'm going to go on across the pond as well, whereby people think it's acceptable to behave in that way as if there are no consequences in the real world. If someone has a disagreement with somebody else, I believe that it's up to their employer to give them a duty of care that when they are on the receiving end of something which is clearly a coordinated mass campaign, accidentally or not, led by two men, Jeremy Corbyn, who amplified Michael Rosen's original tweet with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of social media followers. The university should have had a duty of care to step back and go, well, this seems a bit odd and a bit extreme and a bit unusual that, someone shared an image on Twitter that was between two Jewish men, and this seems strange. We should investigate what actually happened here.
Well, make themselves aware of the context, because I think anti-Semitism is one of those things that unless you are immersed in that world, unless you're part of the Jewish community, people hear it and they think, I want no part of that. I don't want to discuss that. I'm too scared to say the wrong thing. From an employer's point of view, if they've got all of these letters coming in with people saying your employee has been found to be anti-Semitic, without knowing the context of that, that's going to put that employee in peril, isn't it?
Well, yes, of course it is. But I think one can tell, right, that clearly this is a social media phenomenon, right?
Yeah,
because none of those individual people could have been personally had anti-Semitism directed towards them. 4,000 plus people. I mean, that's obviously improbable and ridiculous. So there has to be an awareness of the university that this is some sort of coordinated campaign, right? Because that's the only way that it's happened. In that case, the time is taken to sit down and talk to your employee. This was a bad faith, disingenuous campaign against an innocent Jewish campaigner of anti-Semitism. I have no way of looking into the heart of Jeremy Corbyn or Michael Rosen to realise if they understood the impact of calling things loathsome, anti-Semitic, and mentioning, particularly in Michael Rosen's case, when he said in his Facebook post that Dr. Newbon had withdrawn from Twitter but could be found on Facebook. I have no idea. I can't look into their hearts to know whether that they meant this to lead to the trolling that we see today against his widow, children, and his dead man. I don't know if they meant that within their hearts, but we can look at the outcome of what happens. And I do think when we look at the online harms issue, I do believe that those people with public figures, Dr. Newbon was not a public figure in that same way. He's not, he's not on the media. I do believe that those people who have millions of followers, hundreds of thousands of followers, there needs to be some form of regulation that means that they have to be more responsible for what they tweet. And, everyone needs to be responsible for what they tweet.
I think that's a really...
Millions of followers can clearly cause a darn sight more harm than someone who's got 50.
I think that's a really important point that you make. Thank you so much, Joe, for calling in. And, to bring some balance to this conversation, I don't know Michael Rosen intimately. I think that he speaks a lot of sense on the topic of education. But I don't agree with absolutely everything that he says, but I believe him to have good intentions, and in calling this out, he probably was very offended by this meme that was created not by not by Pete, but this meme that had been created and shared by Pete. However, you do also have to have an awareness of your own power. And this is something that I learned years ago. This guy sent me something on Twitter that I considered to be misogynistic. I had a witty comeback, so I clapped back at him in a quote tweet. And this guy said to me, at the time I had about 30,000 followers. This guy said to me, you have 30,000 followers, I have 50. So regardless of how much you disagree with what I've just tweeted to you, I now have to deal with 30,000 people potentially who are going to pile on to me, and that might potentially negatively impact me. And now it doesn't matter how much I disagreed with what they said. I shouldn't have put him in that situation, because actually I held the balance of the power in that situation. And I think Joe made that point very, very well. Well, we're joined now by Imran Ahmed, who is the Chief Executive for the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. Welcome to the programme. From what you've seen from the online harms bill so far, first of all, how optimistic are you about it generally? And second of all, is there anything in there that you've seen that addresses this issue of pylons?
Well, good evening. The online harms bill it forces social media companies to exert their duty of care as companies to try and reduce harms in society. And clearly trolling is harmful. We can see it in this instance. Trolling is a purposeful communication designed to make the target do something, whether it is to psychologically harm them or it is to dissuade them from engaging in social media, to scare them off social media. And it's going to be one of those issues that sits on the margins of harm, because it's really difficult to be able to ask a social media company specifically to take responsibility for thousands of disaggregated trolls. But it is certainly, it's an issue that's absolutely at front of mind at Ofcom and with Her Majesty's government right now, as they think about what are the types of harms that we see created on social media. And where there is, for example, an identity-based hate component to it, the bill will absolutely take that on, we're sure, when it comes into practice.
Because I can imagine people who have participated in a pylon would say, I don't consider myself to be a troll. What I'm doing is I am expressing my anger. So let's take, for example, a completely different story. A couple of weeks ago, we were discussing Molly May on this programme, and I thought there was some really interesting ideological fodder associated with that story about influencers and what they represent, and whether they're selling young people a lie, i.e. the harder you work, the better you'll do, regardless of your privilege. However, a lot of people took that story as a cue to direct their anger towards Molly May specifically. So she found herself at the centre of what must have been a really unpleasant week of fairly abusive messages. But those individuals would have said, well, no, I'm angry. She's transgressed. I have a right to express that anger. So how do you parse those two things?
Well, Natasha, the first report that the Centre for Countering Digital Hate ever released was one on trolling specifically. It was called Don't Feed the Trolls, and it explained the dynamics of how trolling pylons happen, that, the visibility of the initial stimulus, so someone piling on for the first time, and then the way that that's followed by other people who agree with them. And of course, social media allows for the creation of pylons. It's an inherent to the very design, the fact that you can receive messages from anyone, that you're not just connected to people that you care about, that you're interested in, but you're connected to everyone else, even if they want to do you harm. And in that instance, we've provided a set of advice for people as to what they should do if they are at the center of a moment like that, which is to ignore the stuff coming in, knowing that it's part of a pylon. It's sort of it's the uncoordinated, well, potentially very coordinated, but but inadequate cries of people who are just angry for the sake of being angry, to ignore them, to block anyone that sends you abuse, to take a break, to give yourself some psychological space from the harm that they're seeking to create, and then to report those people to the platforms. I mean, in reality, the platforms do not take trolling very seriously, and we know that from the past. But it is really important for people to take control of their own social media life and their experience by getting as far away as possible from the harm when it's being created. I cannot describe how sad it is to me that, you know, it takes these moments where we can see that someone in such a state of psychological trauma that they took their own life, until we start discussing the harm that's done every day by the free flow of abuse on social media platforms, and that people have now become normalized to think that it's okay to treat each other in such a vile way. And the dynamic of pylons as well. I mean, let's not forget that the reason for a pylon is to make someone change their behavior. So we give advice, for example, to a whole array of people, all the way from chief executives of charities to I recently gave a lecture to scientists who'd worked on the vaccine who were being trolled by anti-vaxxers, and one of them cried when I said to them, you know, the reason you're being targeted is not because you're a bad person. The reason you're being targeted is because you do good in the world. You're trusted by lots of people, and so they seek to stop you from doing that. And the most powerful thing that you can do to show that the trolling isn't going to work and to defeat the trolls is to continue to spread your message and to ignore them. And if more people could take that advice, I think we would have a much healthier experience on social media.
Imran Ahmed there, Chief Executive of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. You're listening to Natasha Devon. It's 8:30. It's 8:37, and just to remind you, we've had some breaking news in the past hour. Last hour, we were discussing the whip scandal, and a Conservative MP has this evening accused a party whip of telling her she was fired from her ministerial job because her Muslim faith was making colleagues uncomfortable. Nusrat Ghani was sacked as a transport minister in a mini reshuffle in February in 2020, last year. She claims she was told by a whip that her Muslimness was raised as an issue at a meeting in Downing Street, and that her Muslim women minister status was making colleagues feel uncomfortable. We'll bring you any more on that story as and when we have it. But what we're discussing this hour is pylons, particularly on Twitter, but they can also happen, of course, on any social media platform. And this is where a person says something which is deemed offensive or inappropriate, or two people on social media have a disagreement and lots of followers pile into the conversation, meaning if you find yourself at the centre of that pylon, it can cause you a lot of psychological distress. And of course, this is nothing new. In fact, back in 2019, Bridget Delaney wrote for The Guardian, "Isn't there something healthier we can do with our rage?" And she put in her article, much of the emotion exhibited in these places is unprocessed and reactive. It's not quite the same as that slow, hard-boiled hate that can fester within people for decades. It's the sort of hate that we don't really sit with and metabolize. It's instinctual, primitive, brained, unmeditated. Its closest modern relative is the impulse flash of road rage. People express disagreement online with everything from mean comments about someone's appearance or intelligence to threats to kill and or rape. And I think it's a useful comparison to make between that and road rage. When people are indulging in this feeding frenzy, it's because some kind of psychological button has been pushed by them and they're angry. And I understand that, and I support people's right to express that. However, the consequences of that are far more long-term, far more far-reaching. People have lost their jobs, people have lost their lives as a result of this. So the question that I'm asking you is, do you think that this is an inevitable consequence of social media? Or do you think it's because in the history of humanity, social media is actually an incredibly new phenomenon and we're just not particularly sophisticated in our use of it, and that we will train ourselves out of this kind of barbaric behaviour over time? Or do you think that someone needs to step in, the government needs to step in, there needs to be legislation, or maybe employers need to be educated so that when this does happen, the people that it happens to are better supported and better represented. The number to call is 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. And Michael has called from Enfield. What can you tell us?
Yeah, hello, Natasha. A great programme, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was actually horrified to hear what I'm hearing, that a professor's going to commit suicide because of trolls, and his current employers backing the trolls and firing them and putting them under duress. I personally think it ain't the media's fault, the product. It's just a product. It's like in a school playground. Bullies are bullies, and bullies create more bullies, if you know what I'm saying. At the workplace, I've been bullied, and I've been accused of many things. But one thing my employer, thank God, has done, has taken a step back, heard all the parties, reviewed the alleged discussion, and then found in my favour, which is correct, and as would have done with the professor. But to basically just to be so scared to question anything, it's it'd be easy just to fire him and wash our hands of it, and that's going around all the time. It's not new.
It's the fear of reputational damage, isn't it? I suppose. And you're right that when something happens within the context of a workplace, then the employer's much better able to investigate that. When it's something that's happened on social media, they probably won't see the scenario quite as clearly. So do you think that the solution might be to have more training for employers, so that if one of their employees finds themselves in that situation, they know the appropriate action to take?
Oh yeah, most definitely. I mean, I would not want the government to be involved, because we don't live in a nannying state, not at all. I personally think people need to grow up. I had a friend of mine, unfortunately, who contemplated suicide because of the stress at work, and I had to talk him, to back up, as in, like, listen, it's just words. Don't get too stressed. If need be, fold your suitcase up and walk out the bloody door and go for a walk. But thankfully he's fine now. But the point is, it's that stress. He was stressed at work, stressed by colleagues, and stressed by his employers. So he was being pushed into a hole, like I'm sure this professor did.
And I think it's important to note at this stage that a coroner is investigating the causes of the death of Peter Newbon. We don't know what the cause of death was, and we don't know that there is a direct link between the pylon and his death, although that is what has been implied in media and certainly said by the people that knew him, who have very kindly called into the conversation so far. But I think for anybody who finds themselves in that situation, there is a psychological distress when you find yourself at the centre of a social media pylon, which is different from any other sort of bullying. And I think it's the sense of, if you're being bullied in the workplace, for example, you can escape, as you say. It's very unpleasant when it's happening to you, but you can come home and you can close the door behind you. Social media is all pervasive. It's always there, and it's becoming further and further enmeshed and entwined with the way that we live our lives more broadly, and therefore there is no respite from it. Michael, thank you for your call. Gillian has called from Palmer's Green. What would you like to say?
Hello, yes. I think there should be some intervention against online harms from the government and from social media support and so on. And I also think that there can be positive outcomes from online, and there can be mutual support online and friendships. And this is how I came to know Pete Newbon as a friend online, and found him a tremendously insightful and benevolent person. And we were both involved in really struggling against the presence of anti-Semitism online. And that's why it seems to me such a shocking defamation of his character when he was alive to have accused him of this, a reversal of the reality. And now, since he's died, when I and other friends of Pete have tweeted about how we feel very sad about it, about losing him, then we ourselves are now being trolled. And very, very insulting words have been tweeted to me about Pete Newbon, and some of them are unrepeatable. And it really is puzzling to me that this 38-year-old man who died this week, a father, a husband and a father, and a scholarly person, and that people are calling him a prank, and somebody said he's in hell, which I can hardly bear to repeat. So why are people like this? And as you, Natasha, said, people do have an outburst of rage, like road rage, and they also, I think, have a great feeling of being in the right, whoever they are, which also happens with road rage. And I do think it's tribal. So, for example, the people who have been abusive to me are the same people, some of them who are abusive to Pete. And they often are people who are really kind of devoted to the cause of the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and are still very loyal to him. And the controversial Photoshop, which Pete tweeted, he didn't, as you said, he didn't create it. It targeted Mr. Corbyn because people did feel bitterly, not that we don't know, we didn't have windows into his soul, as I think Joe from Enfield said, but we felt that he enabled a kind of hostility which we recognised very well, if you're as old as me, from the far right, but this time coming, unfortunately, from the far left, which used to be my homestead, you know. And so there was this anger towards Mr. Corbyn, and I don't think that Michael Rosen was the target of that image, although obviously he was collateral damage, you might say. Certainly he was very upset by it, he was very offended by it, and obviously that's not his fault at all. And yes, it's the dynamics of social media that enabled a public, well-thought-of person like Michael Rosen to be able to somehow summon up legions who then misrepresented Pete and complained to his employers, Northumbria University, and made it very hard for him.
Gillian, I'm so sorry for your loss, and thank you so much for calling in and sharing that with us. And you used a really important word there, which is tribal. And I think sometimes we let our tribal affiliation